Hey, number ones, welcome to Metatron's Academy. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about the idea of getting a international certification in whatever target language that you're currently studying, whether it be English, whether it be French, Japanese, Mandarin. Should you spend the time and money to get certified? Is it a good idea? What are the pros and cons? And when is the right moment to try and do that within your language learning journey? Alright, so first and foremost, I would like to say that it's always a good idea to get certified in whatever language you're trying to get, but of course you need to know what you're doing. And oftentimes to know what you're doing, it means that you need to go and frequent or attend a course, and sometimes this can be expensive depending on your personal budget. Not to mention the test itself has a cost. You might need to buy material. So in order to help you with that, I'm putting together a course that of course is going to be free here on YouTube. But you might be asking, but how do you know how to pass these exams, and how do I know that I can trust you? Well, two things on that very quickly. Thing number one, I have experienced this as a candidate in the sense that I went through the whole process for my English and I picked up a C2 level certification with first class pass. Given this happened many years ago, but hey, the experience is the experience. But what's really important here is the fact that after that, I actually became an examiner and I started working for, once again, quite a few years as the guy on the other side. And not only I was working as an examiner for both Sitting Guilds of London, but I've also worked preparing people for Cambridge as a, for example, examination for English. But I was teaching those courses that we just said a second ago might be a little prohibitive when it comes to how expensive they can get. So yeah, same thing. I'm going to teach you the exact same course just for free. Yay! Alright, all of that is great, but let's talk a little bit about how language assessment works. And as we can read here, it's just opened up one of the many centers that have their own pages and talk about the sort of certifications. And because it kind of gives us an idea, these are all very similar, and at the end of the day, you'll have to find the center that delivers these tests that is closer to you for whatever language you're studying. But as you can see here, it says, in this case, it's speaking about the City and Guilds International ESOL qualification, but this really applies to all different types of certification centers, whether it be Cambridge, which we will look at in a second, whether it be Trinity College. There are lots of different types of certificates, but at the end of the day, as long as you know what level you are when you try and take that test within the Common European Frame of Reference, which is A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2, in this exact order of higher and higher difficulty, A1 being the most basic, beginner level, and C2 being the hardest level or the highest level, then whether you get it through one or the other, not a huge difference. It is a little different in the way it's given and the way the test is actually formed, the mechanics of it. If you can pass a B2 or a first, as it's called, from Cambridge, you can also pass a B2 level for City and Guilds or Trinity. So as we were reading here, these qualifications help you demonstrate your ability to communicate in English and to work or study in English-speaking environments. Now, of course, these sort of tests, which exists in, if we type JPLT, we get the Japanese Language Proficiency Test and Nihongo no Ryoku Shiken, and it's, once again, of course, this doesn't really use the European framework of reference. It's different. I think it's now 5 levels. Back in the day, it had only 4, but they changed it. And then there is a similar one for Mandarin Chinese. You just have to prepare and know what you're doing so that you also know what level you are with professional assessment. I'll help you with that, of course, and what level you should try. To answer a couple more questions, can you take these tests anywhere in the world, or do you have to go, for instance, to London for English, to Tokyo or wherever in Japan to get the one for Japanese and whatnot? Well, the reality is that even though in the original countries they tend to run these tests more often, you still can absolutely take the test in your country. It's just that depending on population size and requests and the number of schools and centers you have in your own local area, you might need to drive to a bigger city if you live in a rural, small little town which may not have a certified or qualified center that can administer the test. With that being said, it shouldn't be too difficult to find out what your closest center is, and of course I will help you out with that in the course that I mentioned I will be publishing on this channel. Now, another question that oftentimes I'm asked when it comes to this is, but do these tests expire? And the reality is that yes and no, in the sense that they do expire, so they have a validity. This can be 2 years, it can be 3 years, it sort of depends on the test. But then again, I wouldn't worry about that too much. The reason why it has an expiring date is because, of course, if you take the test 15 years ago, and great, you were C1 15 years ago, it doesn't mean you still have the same level of fluency in whatever language that it is that you got the test in and got qualified in or certified. It's also important to underline that in my personal professional experience, I've almost never run into any business that during a job interview, while they're reviewing your CV or resume, they look at your test and they're like, this actually expired 5 months ago, sorry, we can't accept it. Because particularly if it's a higher level, for instance, as I say, I only did once, mine for English, C2, never had to take it ever again, got a plethora of jobs before starting to, be a full-time YouTuber. This, once again, may depend between business. Some companies could require, no, you have to take it within a year from when you apply for the job, so you'll have to look, it's a case by case, but in a lot of scenarios, in a lot of situations, it still is good to take the test, pass it, also because it works as an experience. And then after, say, 3 years, if you have to take it again for your job because you need it, then you've already done it once, so you have had the experience, and therefore you have a higher likelihood and chance to be able to pass it again. When it comes to a university, if you're doing it for credits, so French is one of the languages you've got that you have to take for your tests, but if you have a B2 certificate, they will give you the exam regardless. This sometimes happens without having to actually go through the classes. May simplify it, your study program, then is something you can do, but sometimes they also require it to have been taken within a certain amount of time. But apart from those specific cases, in general, I would always say, don't worry about the expiry date. Take the test when you feel you're ready or when your teacher tells you you're ready, because it's always A+, no matter what. Now, if we look at this, for instance, for a second, we are in Cambridge and we click exams and tests, and this is where you can choose the level. You have the version called schools, or for school as sometimes is referred to. This is usually, as you see, for young learners, for students, and really, but you will notice that sometimes some of these go all the way up. So you can do a for school version of Cambridge, but this one is a B1 or a PET, preliminary for schools, and then you can do a first. And first can be a relatively high, it's a B2 level. So you might be asking, but what's the difference between first for schools and a regular first for general and higher education? And the difference is really the type of topics that are discussed. The grammar is going to be the same. The vocabulary will depend. So the listening skills are going to be very comparable, but the difference is that in a regular B2, since it's usually targeted towards adults, what the sort of topics you'll hear in the conversation you need to be able to understand, or perhaps the sort of essay you need to write, or the exercises you need to write, they will have topics that are closer to adults. So for instance, work, jobs, family, whereas the version for school has topics that are more appropriate for a younger audience. So if you're a 14-year-old, talking about job experience, it might not work, but instead it's going to talk about school, talk about your school trip and that sort of situation. So that's really the only difference, is the type of topic. So if you are a young learner or you've got a kid, they are 15 and you want them to get certified, it would be good, if you're going through Cambridge, that you do the for school version, unless your kid is like so good and like, yeah, whatever, do the regular one. But at the end of the day, not much difference when it comes to how you can use this, particularly if they're using it in order to get points and scores at their school. Another question that I was often asked when I was preparing people and students professionally was, how much of a difference is there between levels? And the reality is that the difference is huge. So even though you might think, well, should I do a B1 or should I do a B2? Is there really that big of a difference between B2 and C1? The answer is yes. The steps are massive in terms of difference. Clearly, the C levels are extremely high. They are advanced. Proficiency is how you call C2. C2, I'll be honest with you, if you are a native speaker, you'll pass it. But if you're an uneducated native speaker, you'll fail it. This is how complex C2 is. And when it comes to C1, it is a very advanced type of English and when it comes to your expectations of vocabulary, modal verbs, phrasal verbs, expressions, interjections, grammar. You pretty much have to know all grammar for C levels regardless. And then B1, the A levels are very simple, and A1 is like, hello, good morning, how are you? Like very, very basic, good for kids or for a complete beginner, just to give them a little bit the experience. And A2, it's still quite simple, but you already have to be able to use some grammar, know a little bit of special verbs, we could say, that are a tiny bit less basic. You do need to know your vocabulary relatively well, and the B levels are where the situation starts to become within the realm of more of an intermediate type of English, lower intermediate all the way up to upper intermediate. And really a B2 can be quite complicated, and there is a monstrous difference between B1 and B2 when it comes to the number of, for instance, phrasal verbs, modal verbs and expressions that you are required to know in order to even attempt. Now, does it make sense to even try and start with the low levels, or should you just skip them and go for something that you can actually use, such as a B2? Because for work, usually it's from B2 upwards, depending on the type of job. And the reality is, I would still suggest, if you're a complete beginner, I would suggest to give it a try with the A levels, particularly if you're an anxious type. If you're someone who needs to get used to the idea of taking these sort of tests, then you get performance anxiety, then I would say do it, get used to it, particularly if you have it's not like that they cost thousands of dollars, usually it's a couple of $100, but then again, it's still money. So if you have the possibility, I would say do it. Do it as an experience, do an A2, maybe do a B1, and then move step by step towards B2. But if you're already pretty good, and you see you're relatively close to B2, like if you study another 6 months, you could take the B2. Should you try a B1? Once again, if you don't have that sort of performance anxiety, if you already have experience with tests, I would say wait and do the B2. But if you have zero experience in how the tests work, then I would strongly suggest, no, maybe start with the B1 first, take the test, make the experience, and that way your first experience is going to be a little easier, and then you can sort of graduate into something a bit harder. For me, I went directly for C2, but that is because I had lived in England. I had already had the experience. I was already fluent, and all I needed to do was to learn the mechanics, brush up the grammar, make sure my spelling was okay, and I was ready to go. So it's really one of those situations where it's a case-by-case scenario, and I will make dedicated videos to help you assess yourself with indicators that can help you out. Oh, okay, I definitely fit in this box. You'll have to be honest with yourself, because a lot of the times we like to say, no, I think I'm a B2, but the person who's saying it doesn't know what a B2 actually means and what sort of expectations you have and that sort of stuff. And talking about that, the one last thing that I wanted to talk about when it comes to this introductory video on this matters is, does your pronunciation matter? Can you pass an exam if your pronunciation is not that good? And here is how it works. If you have a very good pronunciation, it will give you bonus points. It will give you bonus points. However, you don't need to sound like, and you don't need to sound, let me say the obvious first, you don't need to sound English. You can have an American accent and pass at Cambridge, doesn't matter. But in reality, you don't even need to sound like a native. You just need to sound clear. So the only way, and I'm saying this once again from the perspective of an examiner, but when I was telling you that I used to be an examiner, I mean I've done it all. When you say examiner, there are lots of different types of jobs. You can be an invigilator, you can be an interlocutor, you could be an assessor. I was all three. I've done all of it. So an invigilator is the type of examiner, the person that is there while you're taking your written test, and they are just sitting there and making sure you don't copy and giving instructions and telling you 10 minutes to the end. That's what they do. That's an invigilator. And they're there also to answer your questions, make sure you don't look at your phone, but also answer your questions in case you want to know, excuse me, but can I do this? Can I do that? Am I doing this correctly? Not that they can check whether your answers are correct, but perhaps they may have a question like, where do I sign? Where do I put my name? That sort of stuff. That's the invigilator. Then I worked I've done that like hundreds of times. Then I worked as an interlocutor, once again, hundreds of times. That's the oral test. That's the guy that asks you the question. So I get the questions first, I open the envelope, I sit down with you, the candidate, and I ask you the questions, we talk, we do the whole exam, and then I send this to a committee of assessors so that they can give you the vote and decide the marks and decide whether you're going to pass or not. And that's the third thing, which I also did, completely different type of training when you need to learn to assess people. Now, the assessors, one of the things that they tell assessors in training is if the person has a foreign accent is fine. You don't have to judge. Of course, if they sound native, it's a bonus. They're very proficient, clearly. But if they don't, you shouldn't penalize the candidates based on, well, I can tell this guy's Italian, or I can tell this guy's French, or I can tell this guy is Greek, as long as the accent isn't so broad as to impede clear communication. If that happens, if instead of saying tough, you say tough, or you say whatever, people can still understand you, not a problem. But if you say tog, people won't be able to understand you, you don't know how to pronounce that word, that will impact your overall marking and scores, because it could become a problem with your ability to use the language. So this is what you have to keep in mind. I would always say, work on your pronunciation, make it clearer, make it better, learn to enunciate properly, learn to perhaps try to mimic natives as much as you can. You don't have to get fixated. Recently made a video about it. Don't have to get obsessed. But the clearer you are, the more proficient you sound, the better you'll score. Now, clearly, pronunciation is not the only factor. Grammar, consistency, vocabulary, even variety of vocabulary, which is one of the things I was telling my students all the time. It's good to, as you're speaking, avoid to avoid repeating and using always the same things. Maybe instead of saying yes all the time, you could switch and say sure, of course, by all means, that sort of stuff, to make it more interesting, because anything you do during a test to demonstrate your ability and how many words you know and how correctly you can use grammar, these are all pluses, and they will increase your overall marking. One last question that I'm oftentimes asked is, do you have to tell the truth during a test? What do you mean, Metatron? Well, let me give you an example, because, the answer may surprise you. Let's say that we're having a conversation, and one of the things I'm asking during one of these oral tests as your examiner is, do you like traveling? And you tell me, oh yeah, absolutely, I love traveling. In fact, it's one of the things I like the most. Then to that, I follow up and I ask, okay, tell me about your last trip, because that's one way for me to gauge and see, can you use the past tense? Do you know your irregular verbs and that sort of stuff? So, of course, you start talking about it, and you tell me, yeah, last year I went to Spain and I spent, 15 days there, and you start telling me all about this experience. And then I ask, okay, who did you go with? And you went with your cousin, but you cannot remember the word cousin to save your life. It can happen. I mean, it's a test at the end of the day. What do you do? Well, some students freeze. I'm just giving you an example, of course, but this could be a completely different scenario. I could ask you, what's your brother's job? And maybe you don't know how to say lawyer, or how to say barrister, or how to say police officer. Doesn't matter, freaking lie. Because it's not a lie. You can tell me I went with my mother, even though you didn't. You can tell me I love tennis, even though you don't play it. You can absolutely tell me during a test that, say, your brother's job, well, he's a professor, he's a teacher. It doesn't matter, because I'm not assessing you on whether or not you're telling me the exact. I'm not going to call and check, excuse me, is this the board of directors? I need to double check it with the FBI, please. Yeah, because I need to double check if their brother is not a police officer. This is, it doesn't matter. I'm saying, tell the truth, of course. There's no need to not say things how they are, but don't let it freeze you, because the examiner is going to ask the same question to another 150 people. You think it's going to remember that you said that your brother played tennis, even though they played football, because you couldn't remember football. It doesn't matter. So don't let it freeze you. If you don't remember the exact same word, it's fine. You can even take a couple of seconds to think, although you have to be careful, because time is of the essence during exams. And in fact, I'll make an entire video dedicated to time, because time is what defines difficulty within a test. Because if I give you 10 hours, you'll pass it. But you only have a certain amount of hours. It changes 250, 245, depends on the exam. And if, you have to learn, that's why you need to learn the mechanics of the exams. You need to be familiar with it, because if you take too long, then that's going to be a problem. You might not be able to finish the exam in time, and then you'll start losing points. So yeah, time is absolutely a factor. And during an oral exam, examiners have to finish within a certain given set of time allocated for that. So they'll push. I know that because I was one. They have to. They're recording. Everything gets recorded because it gets sent to the assessors, remember? And so the examiner has to finish the test within, say, 11 minutes for the oral, or 15 if it's a higher level, and they will. So if you are there thinking, they'll give you a couple of seconds, but if they just move to the next question, and they have to. And in fact, one of the worst things that you can do is to not follow the instructions of your examiner at that point, and try to keep taking time even though they are already asking you another question. At that point, just leave it. But I would say don't even get there. If you don't remember how to say a specific color, and I ask you, tell me about the t-shirt you bought yesterday, and you don't remember how to say purple, just tell me it was yellow. As simple as that. So this is just a little brief video to show you there's so much to say when you have internal experience, both as a candidate, but most importantly as an examiner. And why we'll be making more of these. So absolutely subscribe to Metatron's Academy. Thank you very much for watching. And if you have any other question that I haven't covered here, let me know in the comments below. Thank you very much. Goodbye.